welcome. This is Insight from the studios of ESAT in Washington, D.C. Today on Insight, Ethiopian-West relations. We will explore the relationship between Ethiopia and Western countries, broadly speaking, the European Union, Great Britain, and the United States. For about a year since the conflict in the northern province of Tigray started, as a result of the attack on the northern command by the Tplf, the relationship between the West and Ethiopia has been deteriorating. To explore this relationship and how we can improve it, we have invited an expert, a security expert from Canada, Professor Anne Fitzgerald. Professor Anne Fitzgerald is director of the Balsil School of International Affairs and also an expert on security. She has performed or she has conducted a number of studies with regard to studies. In addition to that, Professor Anne Fitzgerald has served or has worked in Ethiopia and in Sudan. Today, we will discuss the Ethiopian situation, then we will hop over to Sudan and talk a little bit about what is going on in Sudan. Professor, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, let's start by your current assessment of the situation in Ethiopia.
Well, I think I would say that the conflict is now affecting 3 regions and not just Tigray. This has been going on for quite some time now with the conflict spillover into the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. I would say that what we're seeing is a war of attrition and debilitation, attrition through, unfortunately, casualties and those who are surrendering, those who are injured, those who are being brought to sanctuary, and debilitation through military hardware and munitions and weapons. But it seems as though the focus is on 2 key areas, Kombolcha and Dessie. Announcements have been made, which of course are in the northern region of Amhara. Announcements have already been made by TPLF leaders that these areas have been captured, but local media is suggesting that that's not the case. And indeed, we saw a TPLF presence across many of the weredas in North Wallo region, and it seems like there is slowly a concentration into a pillar coming down from the northwest into towards Kombolcha and Dessie. So if you look at the positions of the Tigrayan fighters in the North Wallo area, they are probably ranging from 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, or 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers, and 30 kilometers away from Dessie. And I think what we're seeing is a tactic, operational moves made that have been used in other areas like Mile and Shifra, which sees artillery being fired into towns and cities to serve as a threat to the people and to encourage people to leave town, which of course opens way for opponents or fighting forces to enter those areas. And so I think what we've seen, if local media is accurate, is artillery being fired from the plains on the other side of the Tossa mountain area into Dessie. And local media is also reporting that in the Senyagodea area, district of Dessie, artillery did land. We've seen the Ethiopian National Defense Forces remain in Amhara to try to counter this threat, and a parallel focus on airstrikes to target munitions and weapons factories, to target military training centers, and something that the government is referring to battlefield hubs. So I guess the difference between what we've seen in the last couple of weeks and over the last couple of days is that those airstrikes were focusing on back hub areas, and now we're seeing airstrikes in the frontline areas. So focused on the artillery that seems to be responsible for the weapons being fired into Dessie. So I mentioned that the effort seems to be channeling into Dessie and Kombolcha because I guess this makes strategic sense for a group of insurgents wanting to take control of this area, because they're the two industrial centers in Amhara. And one could argue that Dessie is a lifeline for Ethiopia, and whoever controls Kombolcha controls the road between Addis and Djibouti. And that's a vital lifeline and corridor. So I would say those two aspects of the conflict seem to be taking root: a war of attrition of manpower and debilitation of hardware, equipment, so two parallel tracks, a humanitarian crisis that's still impacting three regions critically, and a concentration into the areas of Kombolcha and Dessie because of how strategically important these would be to grain fighters.
Actually, with regard to the war around Dessie, today on one of our Amharic programs, we had the mayor of Dessie talk to us live from Dessie, and also one of the leadership of the leaders of the Amhara organization talked to us live from Dessie. At the moment, Dessie and Kombolcha are out of reach, and the initiative is with the Ethiopian Defense Forces and the Amhara forces. But I mean, we will see in the coming days how the war goes. But I want to ask you a follow-up question. I mean, because particularly with regard to the advances of the TPLF into the Amhara and the Afar regions, the Western governments, I remember when Mekelle was about to be attacked early on, the Ethiopian Defense Forces, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch were releasing press releases demanding that civilians should be secured. I remember the State Department and the EU with the same address. Why are the Western governments and also their tentacles, if you will, their helpers, silent when a city like Dessie today was attacked and people were injured?
Well, just to go back to your first point, yes, I've also heard that there's been a lot of battlefield action around Kutaber, and that there were many captured, many casualties, a bigger impact felt on the TPLF forces. But of course, all this has to be corroborated and triangulated as ever. But I guess in answer to your question, it's the big question out there, right? What shaped the narrative? What's shaped the policy focus? And anyone in your audience that knows about game theory will know that when one side to a negotiation or a discussion or a game or a military campaign puts a narrative in the ground, it becomes usually what's called the dominant narrative. And there's shifts to the right, shifts to the left, but it sort of remains the dominant narrative because it was the first one put down. And we're seeing a little bit of this, what happened 11 months ago. The data suggests that there were three patterns of reporting. There was a tendency by some analysts of reporting, and we shouldn't just talk about the media here, because civil society is made up of, generally speaking, three groups: the media, academicians, think tanks, etc., and advocacy groups, even local associations. And there was commentary coming out from all of those different civil society groups. But of course, international mainstream media is cited and referenced and referred to by many policymakers and political representatives, and where you're speaking to me from, Congress members. So the dominant narrative was shaped in a way that influenced those views. And there were calls for the protection of civilians. That is a big international strategic agenda that we as member states of the United Nations all sign up to. The United States itself was a big proponent of the protection of civilians. And one of the first battlefield crises we saw reporting on was beyond the attack and the murder of thousands of federal forces across the northern command posts was my cadre. Mm-hmm. And the count keeps rising every day for those casualties and losses in my cadre. And it was interesting because, well, it was very sad because the dominant narrative had gone down already, and there was little reporting around the incident of my cadre. And the reporting that we did see was not all in agreement. And I think this is another issue. Conflict analysis has reached the stage where you have to focus on multi-platforms and multi-domains. You can't just take a situation from one domain and expect to extract accurate conclusions. And we saw a lot of activity in the cyberspace, in the virtual domain, a lot of activity on the ground that many didn't have the proximity to, the access to. So it became a bit of a guessing game. And when you have this very, very heavy dominant narrative shouting out at you on social media, it was interesting seeing the alignment between some of that narrative and statements being made by policymakers, articles in mainstream media, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, mm-hmm. Its equivalents around the world. And, you know, this is the era that we're living in. And I think, you know, let's address the elephant in the room when the same, not just the same party, but when many of the same individuals occupy a position of power in government for 27 years, there are relationships that are formed. And there are strong Rolodexes, and people at all levels of an organization can reach out. And there's no doubt in my mind that that also strengthened and supported the dominant narrative. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in defense to the international community, and I'm not making any, giving any pardons to any part of the narrative at any stage, but this is a form of digital intimidation and cyber warfare that we not had to deal with.
I mean, one of the questions maybe that should follow up is, what is the interest of the West? I guess I will raise that. But first, I want to give you an opportunity to assess or to give us a brief explanation or progress report of the relationship between the West, broadly defined, the United States, Europe, or EU, and Great Britain. Can you briefly give us a status report of what the relation looked like from the beginning a year ago to today?
I think the relationship between the UK and Ethiopia has always been a very strong one. The UK is an important development partner. It's supported development programs across the country. It's supported community security programs and community justice programs, supported the development of the security sector, not just at the federal level, but at the regional level as well. It's supported the defense forces as well, and education, training. It's been a very active partner, and as has the United States. And I think the Ethiopian government hasn't only been a good long-time partner and has cooperated and collaborated for a long time with these different Western governments, but it's been quite a strong humanitarian partner as well. We often hear lots of reporting on UN-managed refugee camps in the world, but sometimes we don't hear about the nationally run refugee camps and IDP shelters. And Ethiopia has played a real role in hosting such places in the country. And not just hosting, but sourcing them and supplying them. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands. I mean, look at the refugee camps near the border of Gambia and South Sudan. Hundreds of thousands were being housed in these camps. And so it's been a strong humanitarian partner as well. What changed in the scope of the year? Well, the narrative that came in and planted itself so heavily, I think shell-shocked some members of the international community. And these governments are very adept and skilled at carrying out ongoing analysis. And different variables suddenly appeared on different radar screens that needed to be considered in their analysis. And in some cases, we saw partner governments remain sort of silent, express calls of concern, calls for the protection of civilians, like you say, calls condemning conflict and violence and bringing the situation to a peaceful, stable situation quickly. And in other cases, we saw fairly harsh statements being made and strong language used, like genocide, and it became quite accusatory. And within that narrative, there were also calls holding the prime minister to account. And it became a very personalized agenda as well. The media seemed to uphold the story of bringing down a Nobel Peace Laureate. That gained attention immediately. And what was carved out was an anti-government narrative and a narrative that appeared to be sympathetic to the TPLF, a group that had, and I should just say that not all TPLF members had a role in the decision that led to the attack on the Northern Command outposts. And I think that's an important point to be made. There were many people that just found themselves suddenly in a situation of war, but there were decision makers. And, we know the intelligence network and the security network that has been managed by TPLF leaders for years. And you are strongly encouraged, in some cases forced, to be a party member. So we have to be careful when we say the TPLF as a whole was responsible for this. Its leadership was, but there was a command and control cell that bears the responsibility, and many who wouldn't have been involved in these decisions. But that was the dominant narrative, and that influenced the policy debate.
Before we progress, I want to ask a question. Do you think, or do you see any separation between the policies of the United States and the European Union?
They've been fairly aligned. I saw and read the resolution that was put together recently and proposed to EU members, which did not get consensus. And that resolution, I know, was criticized by many analysts as being flawed in some cases, ill-informed in other cases. To me, it seemed like a compilation of many accusations and statements that had been made over the last 11 months, all brought together in one document. that was leading to the threat of sanctions. This is a direction, arguably, that the US has moved in as well. Strong statements, statements that have been lodged towards one side, predominantly towards one side of the conflict and not both sides. But importantly, punitive measures that have been taken and threatened towards one side and not the other side. Mm-hmm. And that's a big question to me. Why have punitive measures not been set down towards the TPLF leaders as they have towards the Ethiopian government? So on the other side, I think the EU, because it doesn't have consensus, and we did see some reasonable voices that came with reasonable analysis in the EU membership, and it would be a good thing, I think, for those voices to be more vocal. And the same way that a country like India is speaking up in the UN Security Council. It's done a lot of evidence-based analysis. It's put some very balanced and measured conclusions on the table, and it's made propositions based on those conclusions and that measured analysis. So it would be good for some of those European voices that were the reason why we didn't get consensus on that document to speak a bit louder.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how much access or insight you have into the thinking within the Western establishment, but do you think there are policymakers who believe TPLF will or can come back to power and rule Ethiopia? Even if they were to take over Addis, there will be peace and some sort of settlement with TPLF in power. Do you think there are powers in the Western countries, particularly policymakers, who believe that and who do not understand that that will never be accepted in Ethiopia?
Well, I think if there are people with that view, their analysis is deeply flawed and problematic. And I think at this point, I would say that there was a very disappointing response to Ethiopia's election results. It wasn't a perfect election, but many elections around the world aren't perfect elections. But compared to a lot of other African countries and countries across the developing South, compared to Ethiopia's history and election experiences historically, the take-up and the turnout was very, very high. So even back in June, the federal election had around 75% of those eligible to vote. And then we saw another, I think, 6.6 million vote between September the 1st and September the 10th. So this is upwards towards, if not on, 80% of the population who is eligible to vote. And out of that consolidated vote, there was a landslide victory for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. And to not pay due heed to this and respect to this as a legitimate, democratically elected government, when you had over 100,000 election monitors on the ground or local observers, and you had over 100 international monitors that reported a peaceful, free and fair, transparent election, when you had political debates on television like we've never seen before. Again, it wasn't perfect, but it was an important step in the country's history. And really the first step towards really cementing down that democratic pathway. So if people feel that there is a chance for the TPLF leadership to come back into Addis and control the government, I would suggest that that's a deeply problematic assumption. I think, and this begs the question of what the strategic objective is of the TPLF. And I think that's another sort of elephant in the room that's not being discussed widely. We know that we see a lot of analysis out there that say that there was a conflict over views towards ethnic federalist models. I would say that the problem goes way beyond that. The problem is deeply entrenched in finance and economics as well. Financial flows, savings that would have been affected and debilitated by the change of currency that was brought into place, a new partnership with Eritrea that would have affected lots of particular infrastructure, let's just say, along Tigray's border, northern border areas with Eritrea. And it was power. You know, there was a parastatal model in the past, and that came with an economic model that laid down a lot of private financing, private rent seeking, and a lot of this, because of the reforms that the government pursued, especially between 2019 and 2020, was deeply threatened.
Yeah. With regard to the election, Ethiopians, one of the grievances of Ethiopians, why Ethiopians are alienated from the West, the United States and Europe, is the TPLF election, which TPLF won 100%. If you remember, a year before, a few months before the war, TPLF conducted an illegal election, and the ruling party, TPLF, as usual, won 100% of the seats. And the West still argues that government should be accepted, if you will. And the institutions that are accepted or financed by the West, like Crisis Group, Amnesty International, XYZ, accept the TPLF election with 100% win. But they, as you said, refuse to accept the results in Ethiopia. The other thing that really bothers Ethiopians, I just want to get your perspective, is ethnic politics. Many Ethiopians call it ethnic apartheid based on Tigrayan supremacy, was financed, politically supported by the EU and by the United States 27 years. And Ethiopians have been struggling against that. And there is no single word, even though the West says that they are for liberty, individual rights, and blah, blah. There is no single word to address that issue. So I guess maybe you can opine on this.
I want to go back to your first point first about the regional election in Tigray. I think this was sort of a successor step to other things that had happened prior to this. Effectively, the prime minister was not allowed, and certain other government officials, to enter part of a country that he was the head of state in. This should have been a big warning sign. Something else, somebody for whom there's an arrest warrant out, and here I refer to Getachew Asefa, the former head of the intelligence services, not only continues to serve and to exist in Tigray with impunity, but he becomes part of the regional government and head of security for that regional government. So all sorts of signals that suggested that Tigray was becoming more and more detached and being allowed to become more and more detached. And of course, we know what was happening in terms of the military buildup, the consolidation of a force that was over 250,000. I mean, that's akin to a national army. On the election, of course, regions have elections according to the federal timetable for elections. But what else was illegal was the setting up of an electoral assembly and electoral board at the regional level. I think some of these details were missed on a lot of the analysis. And we even saw an international academic who has an interest on Eritrea and Ethiopia and Horn of Africa affairs serve as an election monitor for this exercise. So I just wanted to make those observations on the regional election. I mean, there were activities that were taken forward that were illegal. And I think, again, you've got to link these things with the narrative, the powerful narrative that has been coming out. And this narrative has been controlled for years, not just since the conflict started a year ago. I remember publishing articles, and if there was anything in there that I think the organization was Tigray or Tigray Online, an organization controlled by the TPLF and the intelligence services did not like or agree with, I instantly had emails that were sent out that were copied to the United Nations, the African Union, Human Rights Watch, and I wasn't the only one. There were many of us affected by this. But Gizao, please tell me your second question again, because I haven't answered that yet.
Yeah, it is just the imbalance of the perception of Ethiopians. At the moment, Ethiopians, American Ethiopians, Canadian, Irish Ethiopians, French Ethiopians are very much aggrieved by the imbalance, not by the call for humanitarian access or for respect for human rights, but for the imbalance that is being shown for the TPLF massacre in different parts of Wallo and also the last 30 years. But I wanna proceed to another question. So I wanna go back to the West. So the West, after for over a year, as you said, they started with these harsh words like Secretary Blinken calling it genocide or ethnic cleansing and all that stuff, and also the EU and other countries. Then when it comes to sanctions, there aren't much. There are some, but they haven't gone through it. And a couple of months ago, if I remember 6-7 weeks ago, the president of the United States had what is called the executive order. And they said it will be, they will levy sanctions within days or weeks. They didn't do it. So, I mean, how do you look at that? Why didn't they do it?
Well, I think there's sanctions and there's a threat of sanctions, right? And like in some ways, we're seeing a bit of it's not a rapprochement, but it's a bit of a pause, a bit of quiet. And some would suggest, as has been suggested, that people are waiting for the Bachelet report to come out. Others are suggesting that people have accepted that this conflict has to play out militarily, because unless the international community turns around, or external actors, I should say, and call out the TPLF for its atrocities, for its use of child soldiers, for its crimes against humanity, for atrocities in Amhara and Afar, and call it to lay down its arms and surrender, then the only solution in sight is a military one. And if the TPLF fighters are making incursions into Amhara and Afar, well, then the National Armed Forces needs to defend those areas and those communities. And I want to go to your point about Wallo and the support to those northern areas, because of course, as you know better than me, some of these areas are very dry and hot and are already food stressed. More food stress than many areas of Tigray, although there are equivalent areas in the Tigray region as well. And these areas, like those regions in Tigray, are already on food safety net programs. And so the reluctance of humanitarian partners to go into these areas, both in Amhara and Afar. And there was some support given to Afar, but that support needs to be sustained. I think questions were raised about this because all three regions are part of Ethiopia, and all three regions needed and deserved humanitarian attention. So I think the reason why this balance has become quite problematic, as you've indicated, is because equivalency, some sense of equivalency, has been given to both sides of the conflict. And how that happened relates to things that I talked about at the beginning of this interview. But what's problematic now is the ability of external actors to climb down from that argument, climb down for calls for political negotiations. I mean, if a group in any Western country attacked the federal armed forces and murdered across 6 outposts in a sequential, planned, unprovoked attack, thousands of troops, then a country would deploy all national instruments of power to diffuse that threat immediately. And in effect, what the government did was perfectly in line with, not perfectly, I shouldn't have used that word, but in line with NATO standardized practice called military aid to the civil authorities, or military aid to the civil power, by launching a law enforcement operation. So the balance, back to your question, has been problematic because the dominant narrative created an argument that was used, trumpeted in policy corridors, in media outputs. And it was very, very difficult for those very global, powerful actors to stand up and say, you know, we may have got something wrong here, and we've just got to take a step back, revisit our analysis. And that's why, you know, you see reporters like Hermela Aragawi being very brave and putting a reworked analysis on the table, admitting that she may have got a few things wrong in her commentary at the beginning of this conflict, and really acting with sheer integrity and leadership.
Yeah, I want to go back to the fundamentals. Our time is getting shorter. The West, the United States and Europe have national security, whether it is the issue of migration, particularly for Europe, or the issue of stability in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia as an anchor state, not only for the Horn of Africa, for the wider region, and also potentially 120 million people, a market for their products. So when we look at that, when we look at all this, why wouldn't these powers take side on the side of 95% of the population? Why would they facilitate the potential failed state by providing moral and political support? To me, the United States government, now it has been a little bit quiet, but Linda Thomas has been in the United Nations 10 times. Ethiopia has been an issue. The Irish, the Norwegians, very small countries, have been calling for the United Nations to act against Ethiopia. So what is the national benefit of, or what is the national interest of these countries, whether we take it peacekeeping force, as you said, or the refugees and all that? What is the advantage? Why not at least not provide political and moral support to a belligerent group, a non-government actor? Why would they consider it equally or as an equivalent with a a legitimate government?
Well, I think you have to remember what was part of the dominant narrative that was planned and orchestrated by the digital efforts and efforts on social media. Part of that narrative was this is an illegitimate government. The Abiy government is illegitimate because it stayed out with its term, and he was never elected. He was appointed by the party. And that became a very strong part of that dominant argument that was laid down at the beginning. And remember, at the same time, the government wasn't terribly strong at all on their strategic communications. So in a way, that was led to really, really cement itself in that dominant narrative. Now, I say that because then there, I think, developed, even after the government was elected and became legitimate, you're right, you didn't see this swell of support behind Abiy, because I think the argument then turned into this sort of minoritism feeling of, you know, let's protect and defend a minority group. But again, that's not the case. That's not the fact on the ground. The TPLF is very different from many of the people in Tigray, the communities. I have many friends in Tigray, and people are silenced, and some people do support the TPLF and have. Some people have many people have been forced to support it. And we've seen what's happened with those who have spoken out. Over 40 local administrators were killed. There were reprisals in other directions taken as well. So on the issue of national interests, yeah, you mentioned migration. The US has always cared about wide-scale migration, and that's one of the reasons why it's established a presence in Djibouti, CJTF, Horn of Africa. Not just migration, I would say the environmental threat, the movement of the Sahara southward, that will create migration flows as well. It will create food insecurity issues, and arguably, although some people have been cynical about the Green Legacy Project, this is quite an exemplary step taken by an African country and something that could be emulated by others. Economically, the shipping routes in the north of the country are very important for the economic development activity and plans for the West in their rebuilding after the COVID pandemic. Their access to clean, green technology and metals and minerals. So they need peaceful and stable waterways. And Ethiopia potentially has a real role to play in bringing about that stability. So we haven't talked about Sudan yet, but the combination of sustained conflict in Ethiopia and military rule in Sudan, hopefully it won't last very long, and a civilian government will be reinstalled and facilitated. But can you imagine if 4,300 Ethiopian troops left Somalia to come and protect its western border with Sudan, to possibly prop up more of an effort around Amara, Afar, and Tigray because of the conflict? This would then give Al-Shabaab greater access and greater freedoms, and we could potentially see a similar thing that happened in Afghanistan happen in Mogadishu, with Al-Shabaab walking back into the capital city. So I think the issues for instability in the Horn are really important for the national interests of the West. And we need stability. It's a very important geostrategic part of the world, and its potential is enormous. So we've talked a lot about negative issues related to conflict, but the opportunities in the region are just vast. And we need peace and stability to support this, and support for legitimate governments.
Before we go to Sudan, I want to ask you one question. This is the issue of big power politics. In other words, the current sort of Cold War between the United States and China. And as we saw in the United Nations Security Council, as you indicated, China, India, and Russia have consistently stood on the side of Ethiopia. The United States, EU, and Great Britain and France have stood with the TPLF. And with the sanction and the rhetoric that demonizes Ethiopia and Ethiopians, there is a lot of talk about Ethiopia switching or being a member of the East, particularly aligning with the Chinese in a potential Cold War. Do you think this will happen?
No, I don't, actually. I think that some external actors will have to, out of necessity, refine their analysis and come to different positions and different postures and different decisions with regards to what takes place in the Horn of Africa region. I think it's important to say that China, aside from China's own neighborhood, like the South China Sea, it doesn't have military expansionist plans. Its main plan is a quest for economic supremacy. And to be economically supreme, you need peace. So it's in China's interest to have peace and stability in that region too. I think we do see a split in the UN Security Council at the moment, but this is not a new phenomenon. You know, we've seen splits in the UN Security Council between the actors that you mentioned for a long time. Where the anomalies are actors like India and you know, some very sensible observations coming from another sub-Saharan country like Kenya. And so the people have elected a leader in Ethiopia. The people have decided on a democratic pathway. What models and frameworks shape and support that pathway are yet to be decided. I think the government has to put together some rigorous and robust strategies and policies to deliver on their promises, to bring fruit to those promises. And the ways and means remain in question because of the partnership landscape in Ethiopia. And I think this is probably where we may see some different moves and different loyalties shifting. But I think, you know, this pause that I mentioned earlier on and this what seems to be a bit of silence on the Ethiopia file over the last 2 weeks is not just coming from Sudan having faced a military coup. I think it's coming from corners that realize the need to shift thinking, and there is a need not to call for political negotiations that are similar to the same style of negotiations that were being facilitated between Sudan and South Sudan. They were two different governments. Here, we do not have two different governments.
So let's go to Sudan. I know you have worked in the Sudan including with some of the key actors in the current competition between the civilians and the military. What is your evaluation, your assessment of the current condition in Sudan?
Well, I think what we've seen is a military coup. And we saw the military dissolve the cabinet and effectively the civilian government. We also saw arrests being directed towards those who had control of information flows. So the head of communications, the head of media, the prime minister's spokesperson, and thereafter we saw statements being made by General Al-Burhan and a big decision taken by the military to dissolve the government and to take on control itself. Why was it a big decision? It was a big decision because in December 2019, there were popular protests on the streets in Sudan to a scale that we have not seen in Sudan for many, many years. And people were lying in front of the Sudanese Armed Forces headquarters. And if for those of you who know Khartoum, the bridges take you into this central area where all the military headquarter institutions and buildings are lined. And that's where the population amassed. And the whole reason was because they knew in a very militarized, securitized society, the military would be the only institution to enact change, to bring about change, to oust the al-Bashir government. And it did that. So now, a couple of years later, we're in a situation where the military has brought about change, but change that is not desirable by the population. And I mentioned on an interview the other day, unless you have support for that on a sustainable basis, that's not, that kind of decision comes with risk. So I sense that we're either going to see the Sudanese Armed Forces accelerate its efforts to reinstate a civilian government and facilitate the reinstatement of that government, or possible splits occurring within the military. In late September, there was a coup attempt in Sudan. And when a coup attempt fails, it means you don't have unity and solidarity across the organization attempting the coup. And so, this was a big decision to take by the Sudanese military. But it should be said that there is a group that's been staging a sit-in outside of some of the government buildings that does support the general, feels that the generals are the only ones to bring about change.
So you think the military will reinstate the civilian government? But I want to ask a follow-up question. As you know, Samantha Powers, the USAID manager, sometimes she behaves or she acts like she's a Secretary of State. She was in the Sudan and she was very complimentary, she was exuberant and all that. And then the Representative Joe Biden, the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, was also in Sudan a couple of days before the coup happened. Wouldn't that suggest the Sudanese military, as is the Ethiopian people, are tired of the disrespect, patronizing, self-righteous policies of the US government, particularly after Biden came and installed Blinken and Samantha Powers?
Well, I don't know is the answer to the question. We don't know what caused the generals, what pushed the generals to call a coup. Now, one important point is that after the coup attempt in late September, Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok called for urgent security sector reform because of the coup. So if you're the military generals and the leadership and you hear a prime minister saying, oh, we can't have this happen again, we need to reform the security sector immediately, and you're sharing power with the civilian side of government in a transitional arrangement, that may have been interpreted as a threat to the military. In effect, the Sudanese armed forces have been benefiting from US support to Egypt, which has resulted in support to the Sudanese government as well. And the Sudanese military are keen to modernize their armed forces and their hardware, especially for those armed forces. We did see the USAID administrator on the ground sending out tweets and engaging in discussions that concerned foreign policy issues and concerned military and security cooperation. This is not entirely bizarre. You do see representatives of governments having multifaceted discussions that go beyond their portfolio as a representative on the ground. But is Is it because, did the generals act because they were tired and expiring of the US and the US policy in the region? I don't know.
I think it's
may
more
have
than
been as
policy.
simple as
I think what I'm suggesting is it's more than policy. Since the Biden administration came, if you look at the key people in the office, the former ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, she's known as a firebrand. She speaks out of her turn. Samantha Power, she's a very populist with no experience and self-righteous. She thinks she knows, she has solutions for everybody, including Africans like Ethiopians. You can take Blinken using threatening words, not only to Ethiopia, to China, to Russia, things like that. The whole US establishment, which is the foreign policy, people call them the blob, have become so self-righteous. The old profession of diplomacy is gone. It is like ultimatums. You do this, you leave this, I will do this, I will punish you. I think Biden has installed sanctions more than 10 countries. So my suggestion is the tone and the approach of the Biden administration foreign policy team is very isolating many countries. That's my observation. If you want to comment on it, you are welcome.
Well, I think if you're asking me if the Biden administration is due for a foreign policy victory lap yet, I would say no, it is not. I think that the policies that we've seen and the statements that have been made and, you know, what some critics would call meddling and sort of bullying moves, in some ways reflects short-term thinking instead of longer-term potential and longer-term visionary thinking. And, you know, some of the decisions have left me really wondering as well. I think there are a number of tentacles reaching into those policy corridors. There's misinformation, disinformation. There's a CNN factor, as they call it generally, which, you know, relates sometimes to very sensationalized media reporting. That's why we're seeing, in some cases, very sensationalized and harsh words being used by members of the policy world. Yes, I understand that the sentiment, not just in Ethiopia, but a growing sentiment across sub-Sahara Africa is very concerned about US foreign policy attentions on the continent. And I think this is why the analysis has to be on point. The analysis has to be based on facts, based on evidence, triangulated evidence, tested, validated, iterated. And there's no other way to develop thoughtful and meaningful policy than to make it informed by good, on-point analysis. So I'm not going to say anything, you know, towards certain individuals, because everybody has their own way, everybody has their own tone, everybody uses different words. Whether some of that tone and those words have been right or wrong, that's left to the global public to decide. But I do feel that there is a growing sentiment that if Black Lives Matter and global social justice as a policy agenda really matters to leading global powers like the US, my own country, Canada, European powers, the UK, well, then that agenda should not be confined to the borders of the Western countries only, with a selective and illiberal approach being taken to the defense and the projection and the pursuit of those values on the African continent and elsewhere.
So I want to end the interview by a short assessment of the broader Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is in turmoil, so is Sudan. South Sudan is also unstable, and we know that Somalia and Kenya are fighting about land, territory. So Somalia also has its own internal problems. So given these circumstances, it looks like the Horn of Africa will have, in the coming days, it will be a hard time for everybody in the region. So what do you think is going to happen, and what are the constructive roles the major powers can play in this to stabilize this region?
Well, I mentioned a few things earlier on. I think that a strong peacekeeping presence across Somalia is still very important, and it's Africa and Africans who are fronting this peacekeeping presence, not the West and not the US. And so we need to keep other parts of the Horn stable in order to support a stable Somalia. And, everything surrounding the Somali elections and the development programs it requires. South Sudan is still very unstable as well. There's still political infighting. There's still tension across certain leadership personalities there. Now we've got what's tantamount to a staged military coup in Sudan at a time when there's conflict next door in Tigray. And so a stable Ethiopia has never been so important. And I think if you're asking me to look into a crystal ball and say what next steps could lend to that stability, I think the threat of punitive measures has to be sent to TPLF fighters and the TPLF leadership, and calls for the TPLF to lay down its arms and surrender. And if it doesn't, and it's reached a stage, as I understand from local media sources, where everyone is just being grabbed and brought to the front line. Children, high school students, university students, women, even the elderly. And so this is going to lead to more and more casualties. I know that not all groups of the fighting force are becoming casualties. There's many people who are being captured and brought to sanctuary and given support and taken to safe places. But this fighting and this insurgency has to be brought to an end. And the international community has a very important role to play in that. Yeah. And with the threat of punitive measures supporting that, I think calls, and we did see calls from the United States that went beyond the suspension of funding for Sudan. We saw calls for the reinstatement of the civilian government by Blinken's office, and that was very important. And more countries have to come out and say that as well. It's not a good thing to have the military in charge of government, because the military is the only institution that can wield the monopoly on violence and the use of force. And that has to be controlled and overseen. And I think that we hear lots of talk about national dialogue. We know that there have been national dialogue efforts going on in Ethiopia for the past 2 years, but a very significant investment has to be put into national dialogue that has a reconciliation element, that has an alternative livelihoods element. Many people have to come to terms with the situation that they've found themselves in, and possibly the role that they've played or have been forced to play in that situation over the last 11 months. This takes time. This is something that cannot be rushed. And this has to factor also in the Ethiopian government's plans rolling out for the next 3 to 5 years. And that's linked to something I said earlier about the government needing very robust, achievable, not aspirational, achievable policies and strategies. These communities have gone through a great deal. great deal of trauma, a great deal of loss, destruction, and they need to be supported. And that transition is going to take time, even up to 10 years. That reconciliation process is necessary and vital, and political reconciliation is vital as well, not just across different organs of the Ethiopian government, but with neighboring governments as well. And the region has to come together in strength again, in strength partnership with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, and in a new relationship with the international donor communities and with its partners.
I thank you very much. Actually, one thing you said, that young Tigrayans are being rounded up to be sent to the front lines to invade Afar and Amhara. Actually, a Tigrayan journalist wrote on Facebook yesterday, and she says, the crops are ripe to be harvested, but there are no young people to harvest. So there is a labor shortage because most Tigrayan youth are invading the Amhara and the Afar region. And the suggestion she presented was that the political prisoners, or I should say, the prisoners of war should be forced to harvest the crops. So as you said, the region is going through turmoil. And we will see what happens. Professor, I want to thank you, and hopefully you will join us in the coming days for another informative discussion. For today's stay, I want to repeat my gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. This has been our program for today. Until next time, bye-bye.